Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 406, and this time I'm going to talk about this record by Joe Gordon, which came out on Contemporary Records in 1961. It's called Lookin' Good. I don't have an original, I have an OJC repress, which sounds superb as usual. Now, Joe Gordon was a hard bop trumpeter, at times mentioned alongside such talents as Clifford Brown, Donald Byrd, and Kenny Dorham. In fact, I think it's fair to say he was one of the great little-known talents of the 1950s. He was held in high regard by notables like Shelley Mann and Horace Silver. He had a few false dawns in his native Boston and amongst the East Coast jazz elite, but his career only really flourishes to the extent that it did after he moves out to LA in the late 1950s. Once he does get out there, he plays on some of the best and hardest swinging records that Contemporary ever put out, and some other great records as well. And his story is a fascinating and sad one, a story of what might have been. Joe Gordon was born in May 1928 in Boston. His mother, sensing he had a lot of musical sensitivity, encouraged that in him. He begins on the piano at age 12, but eventually moves to brass instruments, and he studies under a guy called Fred Berman at the New England Conservatory. He's soon inseparable from his trumpet, and his first paying gigs come when he actually has a part-time job on the railroad, and he takes his trumpet wherever he goes, and whenever he has a layover, he heads into town to see if he can sit in. In the late 40s, he was in the thrall of Dizzy Gillespie, and he forms a band in Boston called Joe Gordon and his Beboppers. He gets work at the Savoy Cafe, part of Boston's thriving jazz scene, possibly playing in between sets of the house band, a band led by a guy called Sappy Lewis. He begins to build a reputation in Boston. He forms a band for a while with the young Sam Rivers, and then he joins the house band at a nightclub called the Hi-Hat, where in 1950 he supports both Georgie Auld and then later on Thelonious Monk. As a young musician, he also gets the chance to play with Byrd. He plays with Byrd for the first time at Boston's Symphony Ballroom. And then when Parker comes back to Boston in 1952, Gordon joins him in a quintet, along with Charles Mingus, the pianist Dick Twardzik, and the drummer Roy Haynes. In 1951, Gordon appears on record for the very first time with Charlie Mariano. In 1953, still in Boston, he joins a group led by the saxophonist Jimmy Tyler. And while on tour with Tyler in Atlantic City, he meets his other great influence on trumpet, the wonderful player Clifford Brown, and that connection actually leads to Gordon's only real time in New York, because he ends up replacing Brown in early 1954 when Clifford goes out to meet up with Max Roach in Los Angeles. Gordon stays with Blakey for a few months, and there are a couple of consequences of that. First of all, he can be heard on Blakey's Emersy record, Blakey, and secondly, it's more than likely that this was the time that he was first introduced to heroin, because of course Blakey was notorious for having his band members strung out. And Blakey's on drums when Gordon records his first album as a leader for Emersy, introducing Joe Gordon, along with Charlie Rouse on tenor, Jimmy Shank on bass, and Junior Mance on piano. The Blakey-Gordon connection is then severed because Blakey goes off to form the first version of the Jazz Messengers, along with Horace Silver, Hank Mobley, Doug Watkins, and Kenny Dorham. And it might have been wise, career-wise, for Gordon to have stayed within that New York-focused circle for a while, but he elects to go back to Boston at this point. He plays there for a year with musicians who are basically of local renown. The Jazz Messengers connection resurfaces in December of 1955 after Kenny Dorham has left the band and Donald Byrd has come in, and Blakey and Silver take the band to Boston, where they record a record, Bird's Eye View, on which Gordon sits in on 4 numbers. In early 1956, Gordon then gets a big break, or so it seemed. Quincy Jones was a guy that he had met when Jones was a student at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. And Jones is now working for Gillespie, pulling together a brass section for Gillespie's State Department-funded tour of Europe in 1956. Gordon looks very happy, but in fact this ends up being a bit heartbreaking for him because his heroin use was highly unimpressive to Dizzy, who ends up marginalizing him largely through that tour. Back in the US in the summer of 1956, he appears on a record by Horace Silver called Silver's Blue. He then goes back out on tour internationally with Gillespie down to South America this time, but the heroin issue resurfaces again and Gillespie sends him home. The official story given to the media was kidney stones. And that incident might have put the brakes on Gordon's East Coast career because people knew the real story, why he'd been sent home, and they didn't want to take a chance on him. He was considered to be unreliable and his stock fell. His tail presumably between his legs, he gets a gig with a guy called Herb Pomeroy in the house band at a club called the Stables, and he stays there for a couple of years until one day in May 1958 when he tells Herb, "I'm leaving town, I gotta go today." For whatever reason, possibly related to his extracurricular habits, but in any event, off he goes to LA. And in LA, he would find 2 figures who would help him turn his life around, at least for a while. The first was the great drummer Shelly Manne, who was a real institution out in the West Coast. He got Gordon some work, and he gets him onto a recording date with Benny Carter, which produced the record Aspects. Things were looking up. Joe brings out his girlfriend Irma from Boston. They get married, and he also enters drug treatment at the sometime clinic, later cult, called Synanon. He stays there for 4 months, and then Shelly Manne asks him to come and join a new quintet he's forming in 1959. This is a great opportunity, and he goes and does it over the objections of staff at the center who felt he wasn't yet ready to shake off his habit. That Shelly Manne quintet I've praised before when I reviewed their wonderful Live at the Blackhawk sessions. Victor Feldman on vibes and piano, Richie Kamuka on tenor, Monty Budwig on bass, plus Gordon, plus Manne. All of those musicians can claim to be slightly unsung. None of them, for instance, ever played a note for Blue Note in any of their careers, but that was a seriously talented band. The second major influence on Gordon's LA career is Les Koenig, the owner and the principal producer at Contemporary Records. Between 1959 and 1962, Gordon appears on no fewer than 11 contemporary releases, including this one. So as the decade turns into the 1960s, Gordon's career is really on the up. With Shelly Manne and the rest of the quintet, he tours Europe in 1960. He stops off in New York on the way home when he spends some time at the 5 Spot with Kenny Dorham, getting rave reviews. He plays on Harold Land's stellar date for Riverside's Jazzland imprint, West Coast Blues, and he's also part of the +2, along with Land, on Thelonious Monk's Live at the Blackhawk. In the fall of 1960, he leaves Manne's group. He forms his own group with the alto sax player Jimmy Woods and the piano player Dick Whittington, and in the summer of 1961, he enters Contemporary Studios to make this record. This record is made on July 11th, 12th and 18th at Contemporary Studios in Hollywood. Roy Dunan is the engineer and Les Koenig is the producer. Jimmy Woods is on alto, Jimmy Bond is on bass, Milt Turner is the drummer, and the piano is played by Dick Whittington. Gordon plays trumpet, and I think I neglected to mention he was quite the composer. He wrote all 8 tracks in this record. After this record is released, Gordon records just one more time as a sideman on Jimmy Woods' record in the fall, in September I think, Awakening. And then at the end of 1961, he seems to drop off the map. His marriage to Irma ends, and he's down and out. There's no sign of him for about a year and a half, and then in the summer of 1963, he resurfaces with a new group playing at Shelly Manne's nightclub. The night of October 30th, 1963, he sits in at Shelly's Manhole with Ralph Pena's band. At dawn, he went home to where he was living on Venice Beach at 213 Oceanfront Walk. Here it is today. It was basically a squat. There was no electricity. It was condemned. He had to use candles, and whether it was a candle or a cigarette, his mattress catches fire. When the firemen rescued him, he had third-degree burns over 85% of his body. He dies a few days later, and here you can see there are still homeless people living in this very place. Side 1 starts with Terra Firma Irma, and this is a great tune, and if you slid it secretly onto a Jazz Messengers record, I don't think anyone would be the wiser. A Song for Richard is a ballad that Gordon wrote for an old mentor of his, and here he adopts kind of a Miles-like tone on mute. The next track, Non-Viennese Waltz Blues, peculiar title, but it's a really interesting composition, and it really swings. I think it's in 6/8. Very, very cool tune. The side closes with You're the Only Girl in the Next World for Me, a solid effort, but probably the least inspired composition on the record. Side 2 starts with Co-op Blues, which is a swinging number which will kind of put you in the mood, I think, of the Adderley Brothers. Mariana is a track which really sounds to me a lot like something that Horace Silver might have composed, certainly around that era. Helene is a beautiful mid-tempo number on which Gordon's is the star turn. And the last track, Diminishing, is a bit of a throwback to Gordon's earlier bebop tendencies, with Woods having a pretty reasonable stab at a Parker impression. This is a record on which I think Joe Gordon demonstrates what he was capable of, both as a composer and a performer. It's a record which is undeniably a West Coast record on arguably the premier West Coast label, but it is certainly one with very strong East Coast hard bop roots. And while it might be a little more uneven than some of the finer Blue Note releases, it's a necessary part, I think, of any collection of contemporary releases, and for me, it's 4 to 5 stars.